Hello again to continue our lesson in chapter 9. Last time we began the lesson talking about this math genius horse, Clever Hans. And so it turns out that the continuation of this story, as it leads into even more about psychology, is that there was a professional evaluation of this horse. So individuals were very interested to see if Clever Hans was really all that clever. And so they determined that the answer was no. It turns out they were arguing instead that Clever Hans was more or less being conditioned. And so every time, for example, that Clever Hans would attempt to count something, he would be looking at Van Osten, his owner, and if there were three hats in the audience or whatever it was, and Van Osten saw him clicking three times with his hoof, as soon as he hit three, he started nodding and smiling and stuff like that. And apparently the horse was picking up on it or whatever they determined. But nonetheless, it wasn't exactly what they thought. It turns out Van Osten was really pissed off about this. And so instead of blaming the evaluators, the people who exposed him for this or whatever, he instead blamed Hans. And so he got so mad at Hans. Apparently, he said he's going to spend the rest of his life pulling hearses. If we want to find that cruel, then I guess the good news is that Van Osten died soon thereafter. So maybe Hans had a better life. Anyways, another very well-known, one of the original behaviorists was, of course, Ivan Pavlov. So we talked a little bit about him in the last session. The interesting thing about Pavlov compared to many of the other scientists we've talked about in this class is that Pavlov actually grew up and remained for the majority of his life fairly poor. So didn't have the wealth and connections, but maybe then he wouldn't get Americanitis either, especially since he was Russian. Anyway, so Pavlov was a physiologist, so looking at the function behind biology. And so, of course, loved working with animals, which is why he fit in so well here. And so he was really important to behaviorism and psychology because he really helped shift the research on associative learning from a more mentalist, fairly subjective place to a more objective place that he found methods to make more quantifiable. And so he was fairly well known for that as well, instead of just his classical conditioning associative learning stuff. Again, Watson being our sort of leader behind the behaviorist movement, Watson certainly learned from Pavlov as taking some of those methods and emulating them that Pavlov used to study his events more objectively. And of course, this taught Watson more about being able to control and modify behavior, especially in animal scenarios. So, um, Pavlov worked on three major problems in his research with conditioned reflexes. One, he worked on the function of the nerves of the heart. And again, a lot of the animals he was working with were dogs and things like that. Two, he worked on the primary digestive glands. So again, with the classical conditioning studies, it's pretty well known in relation to that he was working on gastrointestinal responses of dogs. And then finally, he worked on what he called conditioned reflexes and reinforcement. And so these two, these kind of go together. These are really the psychology part that we tend to focus on in his research. So he called them conditioned reflexes because they were reflexes that are conditional upon or dependent on the formation of an association between a stimulus and response. And again, the whole stimulus response interaction is really at the core of behavioral thought anyway. He also looked into reinforcement, so obviously a reinforcer like operant conditioning will help to increase the likelihood of a response occurring again in an organism. Interesting point is that in his native language, Pavlov actually called these reflexes conditional reflexes, like I just mentioned a minute ago, because they are dependent upon. However, when Gant actually translated Pavlov's research into English, he mistranslated the word and called them conditioned instead. So now we have conditioned reflexes instead of that, and that tends to be our go-to word. So if you don't remember, or even if you do, here's a review. Remember, Pavlov got really, really famous in psychology because he noticed that when he brought these dogs this meat or meat powder or whatever version of the story you've heard, um, even they start drooling naturally. And so you don't have to teach the dogs that. They're born with this type of thing. It's an innate reflex, or what they called an unconditioned response. And so, however, if you go into the room with the dogs and you start ringing a bell, you shouldn't expect any particular response. Nothing marked. I mean, they might pay attention to you because obviously they have hearing, but you don't shouldn't expect them to do backflips or something. Anyway, so what he did is he paired the bringing of the meat with the bell. So again and again and again, this is not something you're going to do on one trial or something like that. Often it would take dozens of trials to get it right with a fair amount of consistency. So day in, day out, bring them the meat, ring the bell, bring them the meat, ring the bell. And so what happened is eventually these dogs learned to associate the ringing of the bell with the bringing of the meat. Therefore, you could walk in the room after the training session is completed and you could ring the bell with no meat present at all, no stimulus of it whatsoever, and the dogs would begin drooling. The interesting thing about classical conditioning is, of course, is this is involuntary, so the dogs really had no control over this whatsoever. So, another interesting individual that was working around Pavlov's time was Bekhterev. And so another Russian physiologist, neurologist, and psychiatrist that helped to make some headway in psychology as well. Interestingly enough, he did a lot of very similar things to Pavlov in his work. However, they were enemies. Apparently, it was because it was started because Pavlov left some sort of negative feedback or review of his work at some point in time and was a little public about it. Anyways, so Bekhterev was actually interested in motor responses, and so people joke in history that he was using Pavlov's conditioning principles really in muscular research rather than in the specific avenues that Pavlov was using. Regardless, he used what he coined associated reflexes. So the participant, whether it be a dog or some other organism, would reflexively, for example, pull a part of their body away from an electrical shock. So if it'd be a paw for a dog, or it might be a finger for a human, or something like that. And so again, they would have that association reflex. What brought more psychology into this is that Bekhterev would actually pair the electrical shock with a buzzer noise. And so people, of course, learned to associate that buzzer with the electrical shock. And so he could do it, the scenario where there was no actual electrical shock, but he would just sound the buzzer, and people would go ahead and reflexively pull their finger away because clearly learning had occurred, right? They had learned to associate the sound of the buzzer with the painful shock. An interesting point to think to yourself right now, and again, if this were in class, we would have had a whole discussion about this thing. And so if you think about this little tiff or whatever that was happening between Pavlov and Bekhterev, that's all in fine, but I want you to think about the placement in history. So think to yourself, what else was happening in Russia during the latter part of Pavlov's and Bekhtérev's careers? So the time frame, if you flip back a few slides, take a look at them around the world wars like this, World War One, heading towards World War Two. Yeah, they were actually in the Soviet Union, Russia. All right, and so if you remember too, there were some particularly harsh individuals leading that Soviet Union, namely Joseph Stalin. And so Joseph Stalin is well known in history for being a really harsh dictator. And so the two stories diverge from here pretty differently. So one, Pavlov was very openly critical of the Soviet Union and of even some of the things Stalin was doing specifically. However, Pavlov apparently was some sort of treasure at the time and was allowed to continue on with his research and really wasn't interfered with and didn't get a lot of government interference per se specifically. However, the story of Bekhterev was very, very different. And so Bekhterev, by training, was sort of a doctor. And so at one point in time, he was called in specifically to help treat Stalin when he was having some symptoms. And so he ended up diagnosing Stalin with a bad case of paranoia, which apparently may have rubbed him the wrong way because Bekhterev mysteriously died very soon thereafter. And when asked a lot of questions, the government was not willing to answer them, and they ended up cremating his body very, very quickly. So, all very mysterious circumstances here that seem to be obvious that it was murder. Anyways, so looking at the influence of how functional psychology helped to move into behaviorism in the history of psychology. So there were the times before Watson, again, Watson being kind of the big leader in behaviorism to keep this school of thought moving. Functional psychologists before Watson were already moving away from the teachings of Wundt and Titchener, especially as they were looking at the whole conscious experience. They were very purists in their psychology, that they wanted to keep it strictly academic and not really an applied science. And so there was a need for an objective psychology that would focus on behavior instead of just consciousness. This was a gap to fill in the industry. Also, keep in mind that the zeitgeist at the time was an overall movement of American psychology in the behaviorist direction anyway. And so, since all these things were in place, since evolution was so popular and Darwin's theories were so popular, really boosting animal psychology, boosting more scientific methods, objectivity, positivism, things like that, the only thing that was really missing was the match to, or the spark to light the fire. And so at this point in time, historians are arguing that that match really was a champion. And so that champion, of course, ended up being the agent of the whole revolution, John B. Watson. So, we can argue all day long till we're blue in the face about whether some other person would have come along eventually, but it did end up being John B. Watson in the end. So, if you ask me, based on the zeitgeist and the situation that we do see in the popularity of these things, I think, in so many of them doing it, I think it didn't need the champion in this one. So, John B. Watson obviously was a good one for that. He fell into the mold well. However, I do think somebody probably would have picked up the reins and done it themselves if not for Watson. All right, that's it for tonight. And so I hope this can help pair well with your readings with what we covered last time. And please don't be shy to ask me any questions. Have a good day.